We're here today to talk about the eSkimming controls required underneath PCI DSS 643.11.6.1, and specifically to talk about some of the things that we think you should be worried about in terms of pitfalls to avoid with DIY, build your own type solutions, and even with some of the solutions that are out there. I'll provide just a little bit of background on the problem space, and then I want to jump really into how we need as an industry to address the problem. Some of this comes off of I was just at PCI, the PCI Europe conference last week, PCI North America a couple weeks before that. Having a lot of interactions with folks in the community. It seems like, in spite of the fact that the controls were to be in place by the end of March of this year, a tremendous amount of organizations have yet to move. Or many that moved last year with Band-Aid fixes before this became mandated, are back in market trying to figure out how to come up with something better. And so if you're in the former category and you haven't done anything, part of this conversation will be around why you shouldn't move in the direction of some of the recommendations that are out there. And if you have done something, it's probably you're here to hear if there's a better mousetrap. And the good news is that there is. But this is all about protecting data at the point of input. It's all about a new challenge to our industry, where the battlefield has moved, where we spent the last 20 years focused on protecting data in transit and data at rest, really advancing the cause through the time frame, with PCI as a guide, obviously with other standards and other control frameworks out there, guiding our decisions as well. We've really hardened down the network environment and the server side of the equation. And at least in the world of cybercrime and card data theft and PII theft, the adversary really has moved the ball to where we are today, which is they're attacking data at the point of input or as it's being captured in the forms that power our online business platforms. So whether they be e-commerce or healthcare or some other form, we're asking clients to give us a lot of information, some of it sensitive, a good bit of it, financial related, and the bad guys are scraping that data and are having a lot of fun with it in terms of the ability to get access to a tremendous amount of data because we've got some problems and some shortcomings in protecting these digital storefronts. And so, what's manifested in DSS 4.0.1 is, an attempt to get us to get out of this world where this third-party digital supply chain that comprises all of the websites that power the world, which is unmonitored, unmanaged, unprotected, it becomes controlled, protected, thought about, enters into our third-party risk management strategies, becomes something that we focus security controls around. And we really need to do this because the modern website and your e-commerce environment, or if you're a QSA, the e-commerce environment that your clients manage, it really isn't their code. It really isn't a website owned solely by and compiled of code written by the entity that you're dealing with, whether that's you as the merchant or as I said, as QSA, your client. In fact, what our research shows is that the vast majority of the code that is served up to the consumer, a million times a day, week, month, year, whatever the volume is that you're doing, is actually completely out of your control. In fact, some 82% of the code and the actions that execute on the modern website is just code that's brought in by this third-party digital supply chain network. It could be, the Metapixel for advertising. It can be Google Analytics. It can be any number of open source repositories that you've used to enable feature functionality. It can be chat, multimedia, ad tech. All of these things, right, have great business value and deliver the consumer experience that's wanted, but really represent sort of a wild west of uncontrolled, unmonitored, highly targeted code that you've got to get your hands around. And if you don't get your hands around it, there's a lot of bad stuff that can happen. And one of the things that I will talk about in the presentation is why we need to think about e-skimming protections, in a very distinct and specific manner. Probably, not probably, in a very distinct and significant manner that is not currently reflected in the DSS. In fact, the DSS kind of misses the ball in a lot of ways, and I'll express why. But start first with an understanding of what can be done to your website and to user data as a result of a compromise of one of these third parties. Okay, JavaScript is the code that's running. JavaScript can basically do anything it wants, anywhere it wants. It really has no native security controls. Very powerful, language that's running on the site. And compromised JavaScript can be used to do some pretty crazy things. Completely changing your page content. Putting, content and content defacement is one part of it, but, putting content out there that would lure the consumer, into, the dark alleyway of, a place controlled, by the cybercriminal. Recording keystrokes, that's scraping, key logging, the capture of the data as it's being entered in, to the forms on the site, adding form fields that don't exist, changing the direction of the checkout process, redirecting visitors to spoofed websites that look like they're branded to look like your own but aren't, so as to complete the ruse. All of these things can be done anytime a compromise happens with one of these third parties or with JavaScript on your site. And as a result, it's a very significant issue to understand the details behind when you get into what the DSS recommends and what you actually should be doing when you look at trying to solve the problem. A little quick asterisk though, all of that activity, everything I just described, in many cases is native behavior of the scripts that you're running on your site. So in other words, the partner that you work with, the scripts that you are running have some of this capability already built in, which leads to a second side of the problem, even when an attack is not in place, which is data leakage of privacy controlled information, and it's happening more and more, and there's more and more class action lawsuits popping up as a result of it. Great example is Meta being deployed on healthcare websites, or even Google Analytics being deployed on healthcare websites where it's scraping PHI that is HIPAA protected. So there's a secondary concern as it relates to just simply controlling access to this information, given compliance requirements around some types of this data. And then there's also just the lowering bar of entry that this capability baked into the benign nature of these scripts enables for an adversary, making it super easy at a low cost of development time for an adversary to really truly drive a malicious attack using this JavaScript. So script management, right, when we really want to get around to it, some people might look at it and go, well, this is a new compliance thing, I got to comply, the DSS says I have to do it, that's why I got to do it. Okay. And I want us to sort of reframe our thinking around why we do things behind PCI DSS, why we do things in compliance as a whole. Compliance is always a laggard. It's always responsive to a trend line that usually is a couple of years in the making before the control or the change in the scope is initiated inside the compliance mandate, and that's very much the case with respect to the DSS reflecting this need to address eSkimming. In fact, it's multiple years, sort of too late, if you will, in the sense that the attack surface has been there for quite a while. The attack activity has been there for quite a while. It was 2 years ago, nearly 2.5 years ago, that the DSS was released, future dating the eSkimming control, by a couple of years. And so there's really been about 4 or 5 years worth of, adversaries kind of being able to do whatever they want, because we've been looking at this problem as compliance and compliance alone, and many mindsets, well, I got a couple of years to do it, versus looking at the other side, which is the why behind, why this stuff found its way into the compliance regime. And it's about the loss that's being incurred. It's about the fact that fraud is really primarily driven through the card not present environment at this point in time. E-commerce is the source of fraud. both from the theft of the data as well as the perpetration of the continued fraud and the use of the stolen data. It's ultimately about consumer protection, right? The card data that's out there, the PII that's out there, as I mentioned with little asterisks, this privacy protected information. It's about brand protection for sure. Protecting your brand from fraud, protecting your brand from chargeback and lost revenue, protecting your brand from compliance cost management and class action suits. It's ultimately at a systemic level protecting the entire payments ecosystem from this source of fraud. And then just at the end of it, it's about compliance. And so if we reframe the way we think about the issue, it's going to reframe the way we look at what is and what is not an effective e-commerce script management approach. And it's really quickly going to lead us to a conclusion that there's some problems with recommendations in the DSS. There's some problems with some of the things that are held out as solutions to this issue, you should avoid them. And we'll get into that as we go along. Where we come from, just as a background and why the hell, we think we have, even a license to sort of think like this and talk like this in the public domain. We've been around protecting this problem or addressing this problem as the pioneer in eSkimming for the better part of the last 10 years. Our sole focus, we saw this sort of train wreck coming before the first Mage card attacks even occurred. Our sole focus was to try and get out there and help harden down this area of WebSec that had been largely, overlooked in the evolution of how the website works. We are about protecting data at the point of capture. We're a web security company. We've been in the game of enabling third-party service integration now, as I mentioned, for the better part of the last 10 years. We're about data security, data privacy, and compliance has been added, in the last 3-4 years, as the evolution of the DSS regime, moved forward. We address PCI, we address GDPR, we address HIPAA, we address FFIEC, but we do so, with a lot of experience and with the trust of the community behind us. I mentioned we pioneered in this space. We've been doing this for, the better part of the last 10 years, in market for about that last 6. We're trusted by the global payments ecosystems. We have, 3 out of the 5 card brands as either partners or clients. We work with the largest merchant acquirers in the world as partners, clients, and even OEMing our solution. We have countless gateways, including, I think it's 8 of the 13 largest gateways that we work with. We know the QSA community incredibly well. We spent a lot of time the last couple of years, deep in the trenches with QSAs, talking to them, understanding their viewpoints, educating them on our, what we see through our threat research and, how the problem works. We've got 1,000 plus of the world's largest brands as clients, and even more, in the sort of mid tier and even down into the smaller merchant kind of categories that rely on us either directly or through some partnerships that we have where, Source Defense is like the trusted name and the trusted brand for a bunch of things that are done at the level 4 community end of things. Directly, we protect more than 20 billion in transactions, and we protect more than 45 billion in revenue. So we come at this with an understanding of the space from the top down and with experience, across the ecosystem. We're a PCI DSS compliant solution. We're ISO 27001. We're a PCI PPO, which means we're part of we're a principal participating organization and part of, sort of like the planning and the back end of things and, direct interaction with the council. And I myself, along with our CEO, sit on the PCI Board of Advisors. We've been on the PCI Small Merchant Task Force and the E-commerce Guidance Task Force. We think we understand the space pretty well, right? And so, anything that comes out of our mouth in terms of things we're suggesting and recommending to you comes from a position of, understanding the space, and a true intent and desire to help you make sure you do this right. Okay. We've got free tools that help you along the way. We've done these things, you can engage us at any point to help understand your scope. We can talk to you about, all the changes that were made to SAC-A late this year or early this year and what it means to you and the scope versus, protecting just a payment page versus going out and protecting the entire site. We can walk you through, our advice on how to build or better yet, procure and avoid some of the building pitfalls. We're happy to come in and educate your teams. We know there's people from web development and compliance and security and IT, that generally get involved, in these types of projects. We can sit down, educate everybody about the problem, educate everybody about the available solutions that are out there, and just frankly have an open session with you. We've got a tool that you can use for pre-project website assessment. Basically get your hands into our solution, for free, for a brief period of time to kind of scope out the problem. We'll sit down, we'll talk with your QSAs, and we got a rapid action plan that can get you from here to compliant before your next rock or your next sack is due. And so, we've got a way to make this problem happen quick, so our solution to this problem happen quick, and get moving. So we're coming at it from a perspective of trying to be a white hat in the space, trying to have a mission-driven attitude on how we're solving the problem, and working with our partners across the payment ecosystem, really to try and drive fraud out and protect all of us as consumers from this threat. So now let's get into some of our viewpoints on this DIY approach, or what the problems are with the DSS and why. Starting in just saying, okay, look, it was back in 2022, Visa, and the card associations, really started coming out, with the DSS launching and with some of their threat research saying, you got to control these third-party service providers, these services that are running on your site are being exploited. The bad guys want to, use that supply chain, do something about it. And so, the DSS said, hey, look, you got to start understanding what's on the site. So you've got to have, a full inventory of everything that's running, all the scripts that are there. You've got to confirm that those scripts are supposed to be there. Somebody's got to actually say, yep, I authorize this, and here's the business purpose behind that authorization. You have to justify why they're necessary. You've got to monitor and ensure and assure the integrity of each script, so that they're not compromised. And you got to have a way to look in and find that compromise. You got to monitor your payment page headers at least once every 7 days. And then you've got to, at minimum, alert and rapidly respond to malicious behavior in your scripts. But, more likely and the true intent, alert and block on this behavior so it prevents the actual theft of the card data. And so there's a lot you got to do, a lot that was said you had to do, and then they gave some guidance in the DSS around what you could do. Right. And this is where a lot of the DIY conversation comes into play. And this is where a lot of what you need to understand about the shortcomings of some of the things in the DSS, really is going to be emphasized. Okay. So if you were to take the DSS and look at it and say, well, what are they telling me is a compliance solution? Okay. They break it down, as they have, in the document, and give you, the requirement as well as controls that might be able to help meet those elements of the requirement. Okay. And so this is, sort of redacted. This isn't the full, piece on display here. Obviously, you should know it by now. If you haven't, you need to get dug in, and get it off the PCI Council's website in the resources section. But they break down for you and say, okay, look, we got to authorize. So you do, monitoring, proxy-based or other authorization methods. We've got to ensure the integrity of the script. And they say CSP and SRI. Right? They also mention, there's other approaches, web page monitoring, proxy-based or other integrity methods. For inventory, CSP. Again, they recommend or suggest that there are other tools out there. Alerting, CSP. For script content changes, CSP. For script content indicators of compromise, CSP. Frequency, CSP, SRI. You'll see that CSP and SRI in many people's minds, because it's mentioned and referenced so many times, throughout the example on the DSS, they kind of conclude, well, that's the approach that we need to take. We either need to do that in a homegrown fashion, or when we look at solutions available in the marketplace, we should look for those that call in and use those kind of techniques at the underlying nature of their solution, because the DSS kind of recommends it. And we have been, along with 80 other industry group members, lobbying hard to get the language changed for one sheer simple fact. CSP and SRI absolutely cannot stand up to the threats that exist in the world today and to the methods used by the threat actors. In fact, they never could, full stop, never could and never should have made their way into the DSS in the first place. We spoke to the individual just last week who was responsible, used to be a former council guy, for actually putting together this part of the scope. And he flat out said at the time, I didn't know anything about the way these attacks worked. I thought this would solve it. That's why it's in the DSS. The 80 of us that have been jumping up and down, we were part of what's called the e-commerce guidance task force, which was impaneled back in late 2024 and worked throughout Q1 of this year. And if there's a guidance document that can be found in the library, well, you see some of the community trying to push back and say, don't rely on these tools. The DSS needs to be modified. It needs to be updated. We're working on that, through the back channels that we have, through all of the involvement that we have with the council. And it's got to be done because a lot of people just look at this and they say, well, that's what it says. That's an acceptable method for approaching this, specifically at the content change management and indicators of compromise side. And they're creating a false sense of security. They're also creating a huge management burden nightmare for themselves. Okay, so let's talk about what CSP and SRI can do and what they cannot do as it relates to standing up against the attack threat. Okay, so here's a real simple kind of understanding of architecture and implementation behind CSP. You've got a third-party customer support chat tool, right? It's powered by JavaScript. It runs on JavaScript. You got your web server, right? And then you got your consumer sitting in the middle, right? And what you've got is, a situation where to build your content security policy, you have to analyze and determine a list of your trusted locations to load resources from, and then store it on your web server. Okay. Your web server then provides that list of approved locations to the visitor's browser. Okay. So it's basically going to say, only friendly iframes are permitted. Foreign iframes from thirdparty.me are allowed. Only load local media. Use our whitelist. Here's the whitelist. These are the things that are allowed to run. Here's the style whitelist. That's kind of what's happening on the back end. The browser is going to load resources from those locations that you defined as safe via those policies. So you're going to say, I trust this script, right? And you're going to allow that script to then be served to the consumer. And it's safe because I put it in my CSP. And then, I'm going to block content from any other location. Okay. Here's the number one disadvantage. The number one way that these attacks work is through the compromise of trusted sources. Okay. Full stop. It's your third-party digital supply chain that's being attacked. In the use of a CSP, you're defining those people as your trusted sources, and you are effectively ceding trust completely to that list. When a compromise occurs at your analytics vendor, or when a compromise occurs at your video chat or your new AI whiz-bang bot, whatever you put in, by the very nature of it being allowed to run, you are allowing the Trojan or the back door to be open and the Trojan horse to be coming in for the bad guy to steal the data. You also have to trust all content sources out front. You have to understand what they're going to be. And before they can be implemented, they have to be loaded into, basically, the policy library. This is problematic in the sense that it doesn't allow for a ton of flexibility. It requires a tremendous amount of upkeep. And there are many, many instances, and we see this, where a third-party script will call a fourth-party script, will call a fifth-party script, will call a sixth-party script. And if you break that chain, because you don't understand what the full sort of custody of content is, if you will, throughout, you're going to be breaking capabilities associated with the way you want your website to perform. So if there's any change to the third-party infrastructure, the people that you're calling on, then you've got to constantly modify, create new CSP definitions. It's a nightmare, okay? Again, it doesn't hold up to the attack. That's the full stop. Forget it. If we're doing this to, create a list of scripts and say, here they are, and, I know what's running on my site, so therefore I'm not going to get compromised, and neither will my consumers, right? Check my box, then we're not addressing the problem we're trying to stop. And that's why, I gave the sort of presentation at the top end and said, It's about the top down, not the bottom up, right? In a basic e-skimming attack, what's going to happen is the consumer's never going to know what's happening. And in many, many cases, you are not going to know what's going on if you do not have more advanced controls in place to monitor behavior. Okay. And here's an example of why. So, I walked through some of that, the sort of like behavior associated with with the policy. In this particular case, I'm sorry, going a little fast for me. In this particular case, I'm going to show you sort of like the typical checkout process here, and then we'll get to the underlying underneath it, right? So the consumer is going to come in here now. He's going to click on that checkout button. That checkout button, could be yours, or it could be compromised and redirected on the back end by the adversary. Okay. And in many cases, they'll either go in the, proceed to checkout, or they'll go with the checkout button itself. As they're entering card information in, what they've done is they've intercepted, the content in line while the order is being placed. So they could be the place your order link, or it could be up top that they've redirected the entire shopping cart experience. Okay. What's going to happen on the back end, is there's going to be, command and control infrastructure, that the bad guy is operating, where they're determining exactly what frequency with which to steal, and exactly how to avoid being detected by doing it with some very interesting techniques that we see a lot. Okay. So first thing they'll do is they'll say, okay, I want to catch the post message from the iframe, reporting that the data was sent to the server. They monitor every submission of a checkout on a website, and they will do this trick like on the first submission, send the data to the attacker, but every following submission, submit data to the website. They're trying to mask, the attack underlying, and keep you from seeing indicators that show that there's some kind of, redirected or changed behavior, so that you can't see, what's going on without, a deep dive understanding and a behavioral understanding of what's going on inside the script. They'll encode the data in base 64 to defeat, pattern matching. And if the request fails, no big deal. They can open a foreign iframe from a whitelisted domain, transfer the data into the iframe, and then gets it outside of, what you would have perceived to be the CSP jail. Okay. So ultimately, fundamentally, number one, the CSP whitelist approach is incredibly problematic because it is whitelisted services that are attacked 99% of the time. Okay. On the SRI side of things, it's a little bit different. What we're looking to do is basically say, okay, I'm going to take all the code from my third parties, and I'm going to generate fingerprints, right, for each trusted script. I'm going to hash them, right? And so then in the case of the visitor, your server is going to provide the fingerprint to the visitor's browser when the browser requests the content, and your visitor's browser, is going to get the script, and it's going to, get that script, and it's going to generate its own fingerprint. And if they match, the script is allowed to interact with the user session. Okay. The problem there, okay, is that the fingerprints aren't going to match 99% of the time. Why? Because scripts are often generated dynamically, meaning that these, predefined fingerprints are completely unusable. In fact, there's so much dynamic script generation happening that one of our clients said they're looking, if they were to approach it and try to hash everything, they'd be looking at something like 47,000 new fingerprints that they'd have to develop on a monthly basis because of the way geographically, time of day, based on user interaction, based on pre-login, post-login for people that have accounts with you. All of that scripting, is dynamic and changes. And so, you cannot, sort of keep a list, right, of all valid versions of each one of these scripts. It's going to add a tremendous amount of operational overhead, and it's just an untenable solution. It also does not prevent fourth-party resources, which are, again, called in a lot of cases by the third parties that you're doing business with. It does not prevent fourth-party resources from calling it. So I'm going to take a real quick sip of water. I see there's some stuff in the chat. I think it's probably Scott. Yeah, Scott dropping notes across. those are some useful links. What he's given you, is links to the free solution, the pre-assessment tool, our 30-day action plan for getting this moving, and then a deeper dive document on the difference between a behavioral-based approach and CSP and SRI. And that's a good segue, because what we want to get to is, what is a usable eSkimming solution that matches to the compliance requirement, but more importantly, addresses the security issue. Okay. Now, another part of the problem that we have, and that many in the industry that know this space very well have with the DSS is that it calls for only the requirement to protect the scripts that are running on the payment page. That is how do I say this politically correctly? That's idiocy. Protecting simply the script on the payment page does nothing to understand, the totality of the threat. The threat is available across your website. When we did research with Verizon for the Verizon Payment Security Report last year, we found that there were some average of I think it's like 23 different scripts being utilized across any given e-commerce website that's out there. And these scripts are running all across the website, inclusive of on the payment page. If those scripts are compromised anywhere on the site, the adversary can use the techniques that I described around redirect, around changing page content, around adding form fields, all those types of things, right, to attack upstream of the payment page. And so isolating just the payment page and only focusing on security around the payment page, it may be compliant in the sense that that's what the DSS says. It's not wise, it's not prudent, and it's not addressing the problem. So, I think we'll see a wave of folks next year, who said, wait a second, I complied with what the DSS said. I used CSP or SRI. I had it only on the payment page, and somehow my site was still used for eSkimming. Why and how? And I think that will be the reality, of our situation until the guidance changes and until, hopefully not for you, but until merchants look at this and say, it's about a security problem, not just a compliance problem. Okay. But anyway, what's a usable eSkimming solution, right? We think it should be one that's usable, that has the compliance stuff, quote unquote, baked in. It does the compliance stuff, right? It helps you get the answers you need, and it helps you check the boxes you need to check in terms of the steps. It requires minimal technical effort to implement. It should be operationally efficient. It needs to produce evidence and artifacts, in an automatic kind of fashion. And ultimately, it needs to actually drive a solution to the security problem that the compliance requirement is designed to address. And so from our perspective, there's a bullet in here that says it should be site-wide as well. Okay. But, if you're only approaching it, just out of the gates, let's talk about, let's talk about the effort to implement. When you look at things and you look at, whether you're going to build it or whether you're going to buy it, you got to be asking yourself questions like, is this an agent-based, agentless, or hybrid solution? Can I onboard it by myself? Do I have to have consultants involved? Do I have to have, weeks and months worth of development going on the internal end of things? Do I have to, move hell and high water, right, to get this thing done? Or, is it fairly easy and rapid and works outside of the box? You're going to need to be asking yourself what teams need to be involved. Is it app development? Is there infrastructure? Is it network? Is it identity and account management, right? You've got to be asking yourself those questions. And when you're looking at, a solution that works, right, it should be minimizing the amount of work and effort and cross-functional teaming that is involved. And I can tell you that homegrown approaches are going to require a ton of it, right? How much is the initial effort? How much is the ongoing effort? Is there going to be impact on deployment cycles? Like, am I going to have to slow down the pace of what I do in the e-commerce environment because I'm trying to manage, some cumbersome, clunked together sort of solution that I've built? Are there going to be problems in the ongoing nature of management of this thing that I didn't foresee and that I built into, sort of the error of the homegrown side of things? Will it produce evidence and artifacts automatically? Like, how are we going to prove that we did all this stuff? If you're a level one merchant, there's an assessment that's going to have to take place, right? You know, did you were you able to ensure that in the development side, it wasn't just about getting the whitelist produced, right? But it was about, making the compliance process easier. How much time is it going to take to go and get the documentation and to provide, the proof, and who's going to do it? And, will my assessor, whether it's the QSA, that's got to come in and do your rock, or whether it's, the acquirer that looks at your SAC A, right? Or will my customer, if you're in the case of like a SAC D, and you do work for, for merchants, or, and you've got to be SAC D compliant, are they going to accept and understand my evidence? Um, on the operational side of things, who's going to use it? Is it the governance risk and compliance team? Is it the app dev team? Is it AppSec? Is it SecOps? Is it DevSecOps? Is it all of them? Is commerce involved? What about collaboration? Who's going to have access? And who's going to drive, requirements behind the solution? And if it's homegrown, version control and modifications, and who's gonna control how things are going to happen, in an ongoing, post day one kind of fashion. How's training going to happen? Are there in product tutorials? Is the solution intuitive? Is it work? Is it built for the actual work that needs to be done to be compliant? Um, are you going to have to dedicate team time and, regular, working sessions if you build it yourself, or if you're working with a vendor, is it going to be an easy to work with solution? Are they part of a bigger platform as an add-on, or do they actually make it easy, to justify its own cost? And is it a vendor that's like pure play, like Source Defense? I'll give you sort of like a look at, like, what we found in terms of the operational efficiency, and, sort of the comparison to, some of the homegrown stuff that people have done, and, using a solution like Source Defense. So, when you look at identifying scripts, you'll bring in app development, probably SecOps, for script identification. You'll probably have conversations inclusive of marketing, or e-commerce teams, however you define them inside your organization. How do you classify them? You're going to have multiple groups involved: app dev, web ops, marketing. Who's going to record signals? It's probably app dev and web ops. Who's going to analyze the signals? What do they mean? What is it good? Is it bad? Is something going wrong? Is this what it's supposed to do? Probably multiple teams involved there. Who's going to verify the interactions? You got app dev, web ops, investigate for vulnerabilities. Who's going to identify the data transmitted? Who's going to identify the data access? Who's going to analyze those transmissions? Who's going to analyze the data access? Lots of things, lots of groups, lots of people to be involved. That's going to take lots of time, right? We've seen, either in homegrown or other approaches, script identification taking as much as like 135 hours worth of manpower. It takes no time. It's automatic on our end of things. We see it from the get-go. We plug in, and, we show you all the scripts, and the inventory is done. Um, Understanding events and baselining and responding to them. 174 hours, of time, in management from homegrown solutions, versus like 5 from the Source Defense end. And that 5 is done in such a way where you're not actually having to respond to events. You're just getting the detail behind them, because we take a behavioral based, preventative approach outside the gate. And I'll explain that here in just 2 seconds, around sort of like the way we work. But, like, it's not event response. It's not developing a security operations program around those events. It's not, cold sweats in the middle of the night, getting woken up with a new Slack alert, those types of things. Um, you know, 7 or more weeks is what people are saving just by working with us, just on the upfront project time for 2 elements alone, let alone like the development of like the systems and the reporting and those types of things that you need for the management of managing scripts in an ongoing capacity, 9 hours a month, you're looking at events, 35 hours a month, a whole work week spent, right? 40 hours, or more, just looking at, and managing, on a monthly basis. Whereas with us, clients do it in, no time at all. So, how do we do it? As a quick primer on our approach, we've got a detection solution, which the market asks for, and some of our clients use. This is outside looking in. This is feeding alerts into your system. 99.9% of our clients do not want yet another thing to worry about and more things to manage in their security operations. And so they don't go this route. But if you want it, we can do it. We can inventory all the scripts. We can catalog where your sensitive data is. We can monitor. We can alert you on incidents that you got to build then response around. Okay. We can do that page wide. We can do that site wide. And that's where the limited and standard comes into play. But standard is where you need to be. I'm telling you, if you want to stop the problem, you have to address the entire site. Or we have a fully protective solution that is just deployed as a couple lines of code. Effectively, what we do is we sandbox all the JavaScript that's running. All these third parties are basically, sort of arm's length away from the consumer. We understand their behaviors. We've got an entire script library. We've seen thousands upon thousands of these services, scripts, these third parties. We've analyzed them. We understand what their baseline behavior is. We provide you with, behavioral based recommendations and controls that you apply on top of these scripts while they're segregated from the actual environment that the consumer is interacting with. And those policy-based recommendations then control what the scripts are or not allowed to do. And so in its inherent nature, it's security and data leakage prevention right outside of the gates, because we're basically becoming the traffic cop on top of all these scripts, and we're defining for the scripts what they are and are not allowed to see. And any change to that is prevented. And so there's no alerts to monitor. There's nothing to respond to. We do capture all of the data. We give it to you in those events, and you can see it and you can understand where the adversary tried to attack you. You can understand how many sessions that there were problems in, things of that nature. We'll identify for you where there's potential data leakage issues, but we're going to prevent it and stop it outside the gates. And so, that's the direction most people go. Again, limited. If you just read the DSS and you just want the payment page protected, that's great. But we want to be more strategic in your life. We want to be more of an advisor. That's the whole, sort of mentality that we approach the market with as a brand. And as such, we highly, highly advise doing it with us, doing it with somebody else. I don't really care. Got to think about site-wide, and you need to be making the case site-wide every time you're talking to anybody about this inside the environment. It's akin to saying, you want to build a really solid fence, at the toll booth, but there is a shoulder that you did not fence in as well, and somebody can simply go around. That's the fallacy in this notion of protecting solely the payment page. So, wrapping it up, right, sort of give us up at the top, if we really want to get into why we're even bothering to do this, it's about consumer protection and protecting card data and protecting PII and protecting that privacy protected information. It's about driving fraud out of the ecosystem and stopping the bad guys from conducting billions and billions of dollars in activity that costs us all. It's about protecting the brand, fraud, chargeback, lost revenue prevention, compliance management, brand reputation damage. It's about preventing all those bad things from happening. And then only then it's about compliance. And we would posit that it's about source defense. We were in this game first. We are the leader in the space. We're going to continue to pioneer in this space. We're going to continue to educate. And so we think we're kind of synonymous with all things, listed on that slide. Scott had put it up there. I'm hoping that this QR code also works. I didn't test it before this, but it should. You can scan that QR code and get to that free dashboard as well, and get a look on it. You can also request a demo if you want to get a technical deep dive. Scott's put the request a demo link up there as well. And my name is Steve, in case you dropped that from the top end. I'm Steve at sourcedefense.com. Scott's put my email address in the chat as well. I'm happy to engage with you. If it never goes anywhere, you never become a Source Defense client, that's okay. I myself have been in the PCI and security space since 2005. And so I really believe in the mission, and that's core to what we are here. So you can always engage with us, regardless of whether or not, you pay us, and it's fine with me. Yeah. Just a great comment. And that's exactly what I was trying to make. Is looking at a comment that was just made. Installing on just a payment page is sort of like only locking the front door of your house, but leaving your garage back doors and windows unlocked. I totally agree with that. Couldn't have said it better. I was trying to find my metaphor, and I came up with a weird one. That's exactly it. So thanks. I appreciate that. If there are any other questions or comments before I let you guys get back to your busy day, please let me know. I'll give it just a minute here and do some like Jeopardy music in my head. Um, but I'm glad to hear that echoed, by the way, because I really truly do believe that it's going to take a lot of us to say that to the people we work for and, in the community environment, to get people to truly understand, like there's more left to do here. This is not going to stop the problem the way it's written. Any additional comments or questions? Anything else out there? Okay, well, with that, I thank you very much. If there are QSAs on the call, one other thing before I let you go is that our solution can be used for your assessments, and we've been pushing that out to a lot of QSAs that are using the free version of our tool to go into client environments and assess the controls that they have in place, see if they got the inventory right, see if et cetera, et cetera. So if don't be shy about that. We want to help you. This is the first rock season where all the stuff is actually, mandated. And so we want to help you, help your clients. And so feel free to use, Source Defense and the free version of our tool to do so. All right. Thank you.